On. It's now 32 past 4 Geneva time. It's now time to launch this event. Excellencies, dear delegates, dear colleagues, let me check if the event is being recorded. Yes. Welcome to this special event where we'll be discussing global governance on endocrine disruptors or EDCs. This week, international experts on EDCs from around the world are in Geneva for an expert consultation and a workshop. We could not miss this opportunity to propose an event, public event, in the margin of these meetings and in the run-up to the upcoming session of the United Nations General Assembly and of the United Nations Environment Assembly to discuss furthering global awareness and action on EDCs. This event is organized by the Geneva Environment Network, the Global Framework on Chemicals, the Food Packaging Forum, and the Interdisciplinary Institute for Environmental Health Research and Information. The event will be moderated by Jen Munk, who is the Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer for the Food Packaging Forum, and by Michael Replin, who is the co-founder and Executive Director of the, can we call it PIRS? It's in French, it's a French acronym maybe. And you also work at the University of Lausanne, and you'll have the occasion to introduce yourself. And to formally welcome you, we are joined by the Deputy Permanent Representative of Slovenia to the United Nations Office and other international organizations here in Geneva, Ms. Jana Lesjak. Welcome. Before we give her the floor, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usual on the webpage of this event. The transcript is available for who has joined us online in 100 languages. There's a slide explaining how you can access it. And those who are joining us online are also invited to post questions in the slide or Q&A box. That will help feeding the discussion here in the room. So with that, Ms. Lesjak, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. It was a bit of difficult finding the place, but I'm very, very glad that I'm able to join you. I believe you are one of the many who are going into the direction of making our planet a much safer and much friendlier place. So I thank you all. I feel a bit intimidated because I know that there's lots of scientists around the table. So please bear with me. I will try to make my remarks as concise as possible and deliver the following message. So distinguished guests, we meet today, as you know, only weeks after the difficult realization that much more efforts are needed to secure an ambitious and legally binding agreement to end plastic pollution across its full life cycle. Plastics, however, are only one example of consumer products that carry hidden threats. They often contain endocrine-disrupting chemicals. These are, as you quite well know, the substances that interfere with human hormones, damage ecosystems, and undermine public health. At every stage of a product's life cycle, from extraction and production to use and disposal, these chemicals compromise our most fundamental rights: the right to health and also the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The International Court of Justice recently affirmed this truth, recognizing that the right to a healthy environment is inherent and essential for the enjoyment of all human rights. The health consequences of endocrine-disrupting chemicals are mounting and affecting millions of lives, and this harms cross borders silently. We must make them visible, as the Triple BRC COP in May encouraged us to do, and act through genuine multilateral cooperation, where all countries, not just a majority, commit to eliminating harmful chemicals. While the path towards a new plastic treaty remains uncertain, we must not lose momentum. Existing agreements, including the Basel Convention already offer pathways for cooperation. The global framework on chemicals also marks a turning point, committing the international community to safeguard health, protect ecosystems, and advance sustainable development. By fully implementing its targets, we have a unique opportunity to reduce harmful exposures, including to endocrine-disrupting chemicals. I also, and especially wish, as I said, acknowledge the scientific community. Your research on endocrine-disrupting chemicals has been tireless, providing the evidence we need to act, reduce risks, and design effective solutions. For my country, which is Slovenia, protecting humanity from these chemicals is not just scientific or environmental necessity, it's a moral obligation rooted in human rights. We look forward to continuing our work with you and with UNEP as the leading global environmental authority to strengthen international governance and ensure the right of clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for all. I thank you for listening to me, and I wish you a very, very good and exchange and discussion, many moments of placing or of putting the next steps in front of us so we can follow you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a perfect, bless you. What a perfect introduction, talking about health here, talking about the moral obligation that is rooted in human rights for humans and other species on this planet today and future generations. So I would like to get right into the first panel where we will take a deep dive, understand a little bit better what are these endocrine disrupting chemicals and what is the status quo in terms of regulation, what are challenges related to that, and also what's on the menu in terms of international policy. So without further ado, I would like to introduce one of the first of 4 fabulous panelists. It's a great honor to be here. And by the way, thank you so much also to the Geneva Environment Network for welcoming us here and making this event possible. Professor Tom Zoeller is an expert on the thyroid gland. And you, Tom, have worked for many, many years on endocrine disrupting chemicals. You told me before, as we were having lunch, that you were fascinated about the crosstalk between cells, the signaling between certain neurons. But Tom, what I'd like to ask you now, could you please explain how reliable is the scientific evidence that EDCs are actually contributing to non-communicable diseases? Can we actually speak of causation?
So first of all, my research in the lab has been focused on the thyroid. That's true, but I have been involved kind of on a more global scale, both within the U.S. with both the U.S. EPA, but also FDA on the general topic of endocrine disruptors, kind of largely writ large, rather than just the thyroid. And I think, you know, I, with several colleagues, have been working on this UNEP WHO revision of or updating of the 2012 document that I was also part of. I think looking at the body of scientific evidence overall, it's clear that we can say that chemicals that interfere with hormone systems in human and wildlife, let's not forget the environment, are causing or contributing to a large proportion, certainly a measurable proportion of non-communicable diseases worldwide. Certainly in the US and Europe, much of the scientific evidence comes from there. I think the problem in talking about this, or the challenge, is that scientific evidence is very granular. There are epidemiological studies focused on this particular chemical, PFOA, for example, and thyroid cancer, a very unique kind of issue of exposure and response. And the biology of thyroid cancer is also unique. It's very different from uterine or ovarian cancer. It's different from breast cancer. And so to think about this in a very global sense makes it difficult to communicate to regulators, but also communicate to people at large, mothers and dads who have young children, etc. It's a very complicated field, but it can be distilled. And I guess it's incredible to me that everybody doesn't know that these chemicals are contributing to disease and kind of what that means. Humans are different. The human body is a complicated kind of system, the same with all mammals, all vertebrates, invertebrates. Life is mechanistically very complicated, and that also makes it challenging for regulatory agencies, for example, to even define what is an adverse effect. Death is easy because it's binary. Diabetes is less easy, especially when there are contributions to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, that come from many different places, and chemicals and their mixtures is superimposed on that. So I do think we can talk about causation within the context of contribution. I think we have to redefine what we mean by causation. If you fall off a building, there's a cause-effect relationship there that seems really clear and simple, and that's not what's happening here. So I would certainly answer in the affirmative to that, and strongly state that we know if we could get rid of these chemicals today, human health measures would go up.
Right. Thank you so much, Tom. That was very clear. I would like to move on to Kay Ono-Woro, who's sitting right next to you, Tom. Kay told me that she is an analytical chemist by training, and she specified that it's in organic chemistry, so the difficult chemistry, not the inorganic one, which I did. She's a senior scientific officer at BRS. Kay, can you tell us about the success that BRS has had at putting the issue of hazardous chemicals on the agenda of governments? And are there any stories you can share about how science played a role there and how you interact with scientists? Give us some hope that this is something that actually has impact.
Right. Thank you very much for that question. Yes, just 2 weeks ago, there was an inception workshop for UNEP JEF project on FIRE, F-I-R-E. I think the acronym existed before. The full name is Fortifying Infrastructure for Responsible Extinguishment Project. It is to phase out PFAS containing or fluorine-based firefighting foam with the safer alternatives. There were like Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya were the participating countries, and the workshop was held in Kenya. And the Kenya Airport Authority demonstrated us to show how fluorine-free foam works. And so they also share their experience in how they came to identify fluorine-free foam that is as effective as fluorine-based foam and so on. And we asked a question like, what pushed you to work on identifying fluorine-free foam? Because they were quite advanced compared to other participating countries. And then they said that they looked at 2006 UNEP document. And all right, what is that? And what I found out was that it was a POPs Review Committee's risk profile document on perfluorooctansulfonate. Yes. PFOS. Now it is listed as perfluorooctansulfonic acid, its salts, and perfluorooctansulfonil fluoride. Yes, I am organic chemist. Right. So it was just a year after the chemical was nominated, and the risk profile that was detailed in the document, also talking about firefighting foam containing this chemical causing environmental and health impact. And that really moved that Kenya Airport Authority to start procuring safer alternatives. And I thought that that was really a great example whereby it's even before international agreement was there. It's even before ICAO said that you have to do this, or national regulation was put in place. So, I mean, whatever internationally agreed, measures needs to be implemented at the national level and so on. But then you can also start implementing things based on scientific information if you find it useful for taking such decision.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that, and congratulations to the Kenyan authorities for that they were ahead of the curve. Real trendsetters. So moving on to our next panelist here, which is Vanessa Araujo from Peru. Vanessa, you're the second secretary at Peru's permanent mission to the UN office in Geneva, and you told me that you're not a natural scientist, but you're a political scientist, which is probably as important in this context here, if not even more important, because all the scientific findings are pointless if they don't get implemented into good policies, right? So, Vanessa, can you talk to us, please, about why getting good scientific information and advice is crucial for governments to make fact-based decisions to protect public health? And maybe there's an example that you could share how you have worked with scientists to ensure that knowledge makes it into impactful policy.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the question, and kind of you to say that political science is a science. So perhaps I don't have an example of myself directly with scientists, but I do know of a fairly recent example from Peru. It was a study that was carried out in 2023, 2024, if I'm not mistaken, between three government sectors: our Ministry of Health, our Ministry of Environment, and our Ministry of Agriculture. And they partnered with two of our leading universities and obtained some funding from the Pan American Health Organization, which is kind of the regional office of the WHO for the Americas. And with that funding, they carried out a study on low-income schools and the communities around the low-income schools to see what level of exposures the children had to different endocrine active plastics. And they found that a very large subset of the children that were served by these public schools had very high metabolites in their urine, and specifically, and other key findings that showed that there was clearly a high level of exposure. And I think the special part of, and this goes to the question, how those findings were then turned into actual policy. The findings were transmitted by the research team to vice ministers in private bilateral meetings, and each finding they proposed a policy package. So they proposed a checklist for procurements, procurement processes for these schools every time they tried to purchase different materials, school materials for the children, to make sure that there were no EDCs and other similar policy measures in the local daycare centers for children of mothers who have single mothers, and similar state-owned facilities that served children in these communities in different capacities, even health postas médicas, like the smaller primary health outlets. And that was, so between the study and the passing of the policy measures was the same budget cycle, which doesn't sound very impressive, but it very much is. That within one budget cycle, you were able to go from the research design to policy implementation. So I think that that's an example of how to take the step from research to policy design. And I think that the need for this bridge to be made, and not just to produce science for the production of science, the advancement of knowledge, which is obviously indisputably important, but there is often a disconnect between that science being transmitted in accessible language, and in a way that can then be implemented at low costs, kind of surgical processes that can be done quickly, efficiently, without the need to necessarily pass laws. It's just adjusting regulations. And I think that that's a bridge that is really important and that oftentimes gets overlooked. And this is a good example, I think, of how that was done in Peru. Thanks, Jane.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vanessa. It's I mean, you 1,000 steps will get you somewhere as well, right? You don't have to take big jumps. I like that. Okay, talking about big jumps, Laura, jumping over to you. Laura Vandenberg is a professor and specializes on EDCs that affect the mammary gland and cause cancer, amongst other things. Laura, let's get back to the science of EDCs again. I mean, Vanessa just mentioned the success of her story was because it was such short term from study to policy implementation. Normally, research can take a bit longer. What is so special about EDCs? Why does research require special considerations for EDCs? And why and how should regulators address this? And also, I'm going to throw another question in there. Do we know enough to act?
Great. Thanks, Jane. Let me start with why they're special. So when we think about testing chemicals, all the different features of a chemical or its hazard makes them special, right? So if you want to know if something causes mutations in DNA, you have to design a way to evaluate a chemical with knowledge of how DNA acts and how cells respond to DNA damage. And so when we're thinking about how to evaluate a chemical and understand if it's an endocrine disruptor, you have to know something about how hormones act, and design tests and assays that respect the principles of endocrinology. And so, they're pretty simple, I would say, at face value. Number one, hormones act by binding to receptors. And so you have to design assays that can evaluate both whether an environmental chemical influences the ability of a natural hormone to bind to its receptor, or does the chemical bind to the receptor and mimic or block the ability of that hormone. Hormones have very different roles at different stages of life, and some stages we're much more vulnerable. And so you have to design tests that acknowledge that vulnerability and also acknowledge the fact that, as Tom was saying, the endocrine system's quite complex in living things. And so, when you start tickling that system in different places, you can end up with effects that you may not have expected, which doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that you're learning something about the very complex endocrine system. We also know that hormones act at exceptionally low doses. So individuals who have male reproductive organs, that's because androgens acted on tissues in the body at part per billion and part per trillion concentrations during early development. And if they were not there during that time and acting on the right cells all in that right time, you don't end up with a functional endocrine system, a functional reproductive system. So if you don't design tests that appreciate the fact that these chemicals have really, really potent actions at low doses, you're missing something. And then, of course, we also know, and what's often surprising from the perspective of studying hazardous chemicals, is that when you think of a poison, you think, oh, if I have a little sip, I'll get sick. If I have a big gulp, I'll die. right? That's not how hormones act. And so it's also not how endocrine disruptors act. You can have very different effects at low and high doses. And that means you can't just study high toxic doses in order to know what happens at low doses. So really good tests, assays have been designed around these principles. Of course, I think this is one area where we could always improve on our testing system because unfortunately we have humans and wildlife that have been exposed to these chemicals. And the only way that has happened is because testing has been insufficient. And oftentimes the early testing that's gone on for several decades has not respected those principles of endocrinology. They focus on toxicity, which is very important, but not on endocrine disruption toxicity. That being said, Jane, you asked me, do we know enough to act? And I think that the answer is very clearly yes. The case for EDCs being involved in human health outcomes, wildlife outcomes is very clear. Frankly, it was clear 12 years ago when the last State of Science document came out, and it's clearer now. We just know even more, which makes it kind of a shame that we're sometimes afraid to act.
Thank you, Laura. That was very clear. I mean, maybe also just to say that obviously the knowledge of the endocrine system has also evolved with us using and spreading these chemicals in the environment. But yeah, it's really good to hear that right now we could do better. So we should be doing that really. Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Tom. So Tom, I mean, you've been working on EDCs. You've been amazing at communicating the science, interacting with policymakers nationally, internationally. You're based in the US, I should say. In your experience, what is the most effective way to communicate scientific information to policymakers? Have you got any good ways to stories to share?
Well, I have a lot of stories. And I tried to think about what a simple answer to that question is. I think first thing is the policymakers have to be willing to listen to what you have to say. That's the first thing. There are a lot of them that simply don't. 2015, we gave a talk at the European Commission, DG Environment, and it was clear that the way they organized the day was a setup to make it look like there's so much controversy we can't possibly come up with an answer. In a case like that, I'm not sure what kind of story is going to help. I do think that for people that are really interested, to make a good faith understanding of the situation, I think it's a combination of stories about, first of all, the evidence. So you have to encapsulate the evidence simply. You don't want to go into statistical analysis, but you want to say that under these conditions, this kind of chemical does this thing, then tell why that's important. Try to bring that into a broader perspective of why, if there's a chemical that reduces thyroid hormone levels in a pregnant woman, why is that important? Thyroid hormone is essential for fetal development during the first trimester, to be able to bring those things out and also make it, I think, understandable to mothers, to young people. I have, young people in my family that are hopefully finished having kids, but have young kids, and it's important for them to understand how they get exposed to chemicals to avoid that, but also why it's important, why it's not too much to ask yourself to go to the trouble to, wash plastic a certain way, try to eliminate plastic if you can, those kind of things. So in terms of policymakers, I think it's really complicated. I'd love to hear a story about where science informed policy at a local level that is significant without regulators being involved, without being forced to do the right thing. But that's not my uniform experience. And so I think it's always a challenge, and you can never be good enough at it that you can't stop trying to work on that.
So I guess in a way, if I understood you correctly, we as scientists need to make sure that people care enough to tell their policymakers, their elected government officials, that they want something to be done about this issue, right?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Okay. Well, Kai, moving on to you. What are the main challenges with joint decision making when I mean, Tom was alluding to individual policymakers that need to be willing to listen. What about at the BRS when you have a room full of policymakers? Do they want to listen? Or, I mean, what are the main challenges there? And can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek what's on the horizon, what to expect in BRS in the near future?
Right. So I think I will talk more about the Stockholm Convention in this case. So, well, so PFAS that I mentioned, they have the exhibit endocrine disrupting properties, but this risk profile document was developed by the POPs Review Committee, which is a scientific subsidiary body to the Stockholm Convention that looks at scientific information generated by academia or industry or parties and so on. So in that forum, it is very important to have scientific information available to the committee for consideration. And of course, adverse effect is one of the POPs characteristic that includes endocrine disruption as its endpoint. And so, yeah, it doesn't really look at endocrine disruption per se, but it's the adverse effect that is very important for the committee to consider. For example, next September, I mean, this coming 4 weeks, the committee will consider draft risk profile on polybrominated dibenzopyridioxins and furans and the mixture of polybrominated and chlorinated dibenzopyridioxins and furans. These are unintentionally released chemicals from burning of organic materials that may contain bromines or chlorines, like plastics, for example, with added flame retardants and so on. So this risk profile will be considered, and any of the scientific information that relates to these POPs characteristics, these 4 elements, are quite important. But when it comes to decision making, indeed, the consensus building may become sometimes challenging. But the Stockholm Convention has very important passage in Article 8. It says lack of full scientific certainty should not prevent the proposal from proceeding. So like you just said, like, is it enough to act? It also has mentioning of precautionary manner. And so the COP should take decision, including scientific uncertainty, in a precautionary manner, whether the chemical should be listed in the Stockholm Convention. This is to achieve the objective of the Stockholm Convention, which is to protect human health and environment from persistent organic pollutants. So taking into account, different capacity of countries, developing countries, developed countries, different stages of economic development and interest, and so on, it is quite important that the parties feel the same objectives and also have the information about alternatives that will, keep economy going while protecting human health and the environment. So it's not just only the POPs that are targeted, but also the replacement and so on. And that is why it's also important to work with, for example, Global Framework on Chemicals, not just only those legally binding chemicals, but also the related substances that might help such decision making in a very restrictive manner under the Stockholm Convention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kay. It's also really nice to see how passionate you are about the Stockholm Convention. I agree. It's really good to see this working and being so effective. Vanessa, back to you. And you shared a beautiful story before about science being really policy relevant and implemented. In a perfect world, is there any room to improve on that story? Like, what would make the perfect sort of translation of science into policy, or sort of criteria that would make it very helpful for you? And this is especially for the researchers here in the room that are listening. How can we in the scientific community design our studies and communicate our studies so that it becomes more useful to you policymakers?
Thank you, Jane, also for a really interesting question. I think in Peru's, because I can only speak to the Peruvian example, but I think that our case is kind of similar to many others. I think one of the problems we have processing science is that the mandate to address this from like a public policy perspective is typically split among many sectors. So when there's no coordination or no clear leader as to who's going to take who's going to spearhead any kind of policy, then you get really slow processing of the information and slow implementation of any kind of policy recommendation. That's one challenge that we have. Another one is differing levels of capacity and of access to evidence. There are few centers that can do national biomonitoring. There's a sluggish product surveillance process. There's at a local level almost no toxicology assessments, and then the available analysis is not tailored for your national situation. So for example, in Peru, there's very different, we have a predominantly informal economic, informal economy. We have differences in exposure, stark differences in exposures between rural and urban settings. The types of exposures are quite different. So just one policy is probably not the most suited for us. And then primarily our exposures come from imported goods. So that's another characteristic of Peru's experience with EDCs, and not a lot of policy recommendations have address all three of those factors. So you don't have a one size fits all, and that makes it more challenging. The other thing is there's a lot of science that is funded by industry. So the conclusions are slightly different. And when you have conflicting conclusions or dissimilar, not 100% consensus in the conclusion of the available science, that leads decision makers and regulators to put up much higher thresholds because you're not sure. And that allows for certain status quo situations to endure. And then there's, I think, a mismatch between how information is communicated. So on the one hand, for regulators, technical briefs are really complicated. They're difficult to read and difficult to understand what the policy suggestion is. And at the same time, awareness raising campaigns are very rarely done in Spanish, and in indigenous languages, virtually none. And even the ones that are in Spanish, as an educated person, I read that and say, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So I think that all of that is a kind of very heavy barriers. So in terms of how to make kind of the story of the assessment and public goods for public schools better, I think it'd be important for the government to have a leader, a public policy leader on EDCs, and I think that would probably at the same time go well with including it in your NCDs, your non-communicable disease strategy. So I think that that's probably an easier way to address EDCs, is if you integrate it into like your health agenda. And I keep coming back to this, but kind of plain language policy briefs that are one page, that say, this is our problem, this is why it's a public health issue or an environment issue or whatever. What we know, your options in your legal context, and then how much it would cost, who should implement it. So just quite clearly dummy proof, a very clear proposal. And I think that would also help, as was the case with the public schools and their procurement processes. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I'd love to dig more into that, but time is not on our side. We only have a couple minutes to wrap up this panel. I took note of what you said last. How much would it cost? I hope that the next panel will come into that, go into that a little bit more. But before we move on, I would like to ask Laura about coming back to the testing of EDCs again. Obviously, this is very important, as Vanessa said already, clear communication, who should do what will it cost? Why is the testing of EDCs so challenging? And what are other additional challenges for better regulating EDCs to effectively protect public health?
Yeah, thank you. I think we should have let Vanessa have the last word because she said all the important things. One is that, and really, I appreciate your comments because you put them in a context from a scientist that I think really break down what the challenge is. One is that even when the same test is looked at by different regulators, they come to different conclusions. And, you know, there's a place for honest scientific disagreement, and then sometimes it transcends that. And I think that the chemical that I worked on for the first 10 years of my career, bisphenol A, BPA, really is an example of that, where, you know, the European Union has taken action to reduce human exposures to BPA based on clear evidence, and yet it's still 20 years late because they did that based on something that I knew when I was a grad student. And so, and yet in the US, that action's not being taken. The US regulators are not buying into the evidence that shows that BPA causes harm. So these are not straightforward issues, and sometimes it can be very challenging from the outside to know where is there an honest scientific debate or discussion about the evidence, and when is that crossed over. And I think, you know, Vanessa's point about sometimes the evidence is also being contributed by people or groups with vested interests, and that can be done to pollute decision making and pollute the scientific literature, and you have to be aware of that, and sometimes it's hidden, and that is one challenge. I think the other challenge is that there's a little bit of chemical whack-a-mole. So, you know, as BPA has been phased out over 20 years, not because of regulation, but because of people who didn't want to feed their kids food or baby bottles with BPA in it, we instead have, I don't know, 20, 50 replacement chemicals. And we have less testing available. We have less information. We don't even know about exposures to a lot of those chemicals. And so, you know, that we keep, I feel a little bit like the Charlie Brown, you know, the football keeps moving and we keep running at it and kicking at it, and we're never going to hit the goal. And I think that the issue here is that science must be resolute in saying these are the principles, this is what testing should be done, and we know enough in many of these cases to act with the information that's available.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. I completely agree. And I think all of the panelists mentioned us now that we need more awareness for chemicals. I think what you also mentioned, Vanessa, is there needs to be capacity building. I mean, not every country has all this knowledge, but almost every country in the world is importing these chemicals and these products that contain hazardous chemicals. So I think that there's also a big gap there. And as a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Heindel, keeps saying, the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. I think I will leave it at that for now and hand over to my wonderful co-moderator, Michael, please, to kick off the second panel. Thanks.
Thanks. Oh. Thanks a lot, Jane, and thanks to the Geneva Environmental Network for having us today, for organizing this important discussion. So to introduce this policy panel, we just heard that science panel demonstrated that strengthened EDC evidence across multiple domains is an evidence now. We know the mechanisms, we know the health and environmental impacts, and as it was said, we know enough to act. So a key question emerges now. So how do governance structures shape policy responses to this complex scientific evidence like EDCs? And what popped up from the previous discussion is that we have a transmission challenge between this robust scientific foundation and the policy translation. So how could it be addressed? So in our discussion now, we will examine three interconnected dimensions. So first, we will discuss about the institutional mechanisms and how do new frameworks like the Global Framework on Chemicals and the Science Policy Panel address EDCs as part of a broader chemical governance. And then we will highlight the health dimension and how should quantified health cost should reshape governance priorities, especially if current frameworks are primarily to be environment-led. And finally, we'll dive into the local level and to see how and why international ambition encounter national implementation barriers and what are the factors of these difficulties. But let's begin in our first examination with the institutional architecture. So as you might know, we have new institutional mechanisms, and it offers an unprecedented opportunity for coordinating EDC's governance. So let's examine how these institutional advances can be leveraged for effective action. And we'll give the floor to Kay Williams. So Kay is the head of the Global Framework on Chemicals. She has more than 20 years of experience in international chemicals policy. And she co-chaired the SECAM to GFC transition negotiation to the former system. And my question for you, Kay, is while EDCs remain temporarily as an issue of concern pending 2026 conference decisions, we see that the GFC represents a significant institutional evolution for sure. So what are the concrete institutional innovation that the global framework brings compared to the previous system? And how do these new mechanisms create different pathways for addressing complex issues like EDCs at the national level? Thanks, Kay.
Thank you very much, Michael. And there was a lot in that question. So first of all, yes, indeed, in September 2023, the community of chemicals and waste adopted the global framework on chemicals and waste, which is very different from its predecessor, SICAM. I think one of the main differences is that we have agreed 28 political targets, which fall under 5 strategic objectives. So there's much more of a framework to which people can be taking action, and that they'll be able to measure that action and progress that they are taking. And it covers a wide range of themes and sectors. A lot of the work also addresses new people in our community. So it is understanding that we need to work along the value chain. We need to work with businesses and companies, as well as with the finance sector, because it's with the investors that they have the impact with the businesses. And by having that understanding, it provides us with a lever that we can hopefully change direction and the course of direction of some companies to make sure that we're still working together in a sustainable fashion. So these actors are essential for transformational change, but not only to protect our health, but also the environment and to evolve our economies, because the economies don't go away. The politicians are very interested in the economy, and we need to be working together to expand businesses in a sustainable way. The focus of the framework is very much about implementation. SciCam was ahead of its time in many ways as a policy framework, but it did lack a little bit of the teeth in terms of being able to implement. And I think we're now at a stage where implementation is urgent and needs to be taken at all levels. So that's at the global level, the regional level, and the national level. And to provide the structures and coordination necessary to make sure that those platforms are in place, and so that we can provide and co-create guidance with the experts, exchange knowledge. And one of the mechanisms that was developed under the framework is called an implementation program on a global level. And these global implementation programs are being set up as I speak to have a set of common components, but a degree of flexibility so they can work with a wide range of stakeholders on another number of topics. So we're working very closely with international organizations, the IMC organizations, looking at a number of themes. So one of the implementation programs is really focusing on the institutional structures and the regulation, and that's going to be absolutely key, I think, for looking at how we address EDCs potentially through that regulation, together with, I think, BRS and those legally binding conventions. The second global implementation program is focusing on sectors. And this is a new area, I think, where we're trying to look at those sectors which are, if you like, chemically intensive, and that should be addressed in a coherent way. And the initial focus is on textiles, electronics. There's also a healthcare proposition coming forward, and construction, where is also a huge amount of chemicals being used. The finance sector is also being taken forward, and whether that's a cross-cutting theme or program, that's still yet to be decided. But we're working really very closely with the banks and organizations like UNEP FI to make sure that we can take that forward. And the final one is about partnerships and working together on the sustainable development front to make sure that we're getting that decision making across the piece with not only within the environment, but also with health and labour and others organisations. So in terms of the programmes, there'll be common terms of reference, but we also have other mechanisms, and there's an opportunity to set up a global alliance on highly hazardous pesticides, where for those pesticides that do have endocrine disrupting properties, that alliance can be taken forward and can contribute to taking action there. But I think one of the key questions that needs to be asked when looking at the global framework is why is the framework best placed to take forward a particular issue? So why choose it? It is multi-sectoral, it is multi-stakeholder, but it's voluntary. So it doesn't have that regulatory, I suppose, stick. But it has lots of carrots, and it has lots of people round the table that can work together in that voluntary fashion. And that has tremendous value, but we have to understand where and when we use that value. And I think we need to make sure that if we take forward the endocrine disrupting chemicals and continue to take forward as an issue of concern, whether it does meet those criteria of being able to add value and how to develop a work plan with indicators, etc. Because I think for others, issues of concern, and it could be that maybe the framework isn't the right place to provide some of the activities that would fall under endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we need to look at whether science panels might be better for providing some of the gaps that are still available. I know the newly established Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution has been established, but has got a long way to go to be effective, but it does offer an opportunity. It was born out of the original SciCam, and I do think that it's important that we have a close relationship under the framework with that panel. But we can also work with biodiversity science policy panels such as IPBES and others to make sure that we can take the appropriate action. And then finally, I think on the national level, you talked about complexities. We are reviewing how we work with our national focal points. It's very important that we engage not only the environment, but the health and the labour sectors, and also those in business as well. So we're looking at how to build up that capacity, how to bring training, how to work with those national focal points together so that we can really coordinate and make a difference on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay, for your institutional perspective. So now I'm turning to you, Professor Martin Scheringer. So you're a professor of environmental chemistry at Masaryk University and also ETH at Zurich. You are the co-initiator in 2006 of the concept of an international panel on chemical pollution. And you also led several projects on EDCs for UNEP, and you have more than 25 years of experience in this science policy interface. So given that we have sufficient science on EDCs, but we face persistent governance difficulties, to say the least, how should this new science policy panel approach scientific assessments to better support the application of the precautionary principle? And what mechanisms can ensure that scientific uncertainty doesn't become a barrier to this precautionary policy action?
Thank you very much, Michael, for this invitation to speak here and the introduction. In response to your question, first, as Kay just said, unfortunately, the new panel, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution, is not really ready for such a task. Many key elements of the panel were not agreed on at the last meeting. Several people here in the room were at the last meeting in Uruguay. And in a way, the panel is hamstrung or incapacitated and not ready for actual work. And it may be a long way for the panel to become operational. So that's unfortunately a rather complicated situation for the panel to become really effective in our discussions and in the work that we're discussing here. A second point that has come to my mind over the last years is that what we normally refer to as a science policy interface is more or mostly a science regulators interface. I work a lot with regulators in many countries, and that is often very effective and good and in a collegial and collaborative spirit. But I have very rarely been able to talk to actual politicians, be it members of parliament or ministers. So we don't have a science policy interface. We have a science regulators interface. I was able once to speak to a member of the German parliament for several hours about, in this case, PFAS. And I was impressed by how much work such a person has to do and to handle and to successfully manage. But I was also shocked in a way and frustrated or concerned because my thought was, how is this going to work if they are so overloaded? So I'm not blaming any politician for being overloaded and difficult to approach. It's part of the system, I think. But I think we don't really have a science policy interface in place. So I'm not really sure how we can convey our insights to politicians, really. I think we should work with the media. That's what I have done over the last months on the PFAS topic here in Switzerland a lot. And we may say what's in the media matters to politicians. I'm not saying the opposite. Also, other things that are not in the media may matter to politicians, but what is in the media matters. And that's, I guess, a good guideline. Then you mentioned uncertainty, and of course, there's always uncertainty in scientific work. It's part of the scientific work, and we have to handle that. But I think in our work and our communication of our results and insights to non-scientists, we should always start from something that we do know, so that is kind of certain, because people would have to have a positive message to keep in mind and to hold on to. And we also have to make very clear, although there are lots of gaps and uncertainties, we have to make very clear that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it is not no data, no problem. And that's also part of our message as scientists to non-scientists. Thank you.
Thanks. thanks a lot for your explanations. And maybe a quick follow-up question also based on your IPCP experience. So you've just explained that the panel is not ready, of course, to act, but could you maybe give us a bit more details on the biggest gaps you see between that, what the scientific panels can realistically deliver, theoretically now, and actually, and maybe this level of reflection that we should have, what policymakers actually need to implement these precautionary approaches to EDC that you have just mentioned.
Yes, I was really impressed by what you said, Vanessa, about the situation that your experience from the actual implementation or the transfer of scientific outcome to decision makers at various levels. And so I think it's both, it's the what and the how. So a lot of it is about the how. How do we speak? What format, what language do we use? And we have to really think and learn here, we as scientists, because I think we need is kind of concise and punchy messages that are still true and scientifically sound, but they should be easy to grasp and strong. So maybe we have to really change the way we speak. We should speak differently from how we speak to other scientists. What I've learned in my media experiences over the last weeks and months is that we should really say the most important thing first and then stop. Which is not easy, because normally scientists do the opposite. They explain all the other things first, and then they come to the most important thing. For a reason. It's not to say that's just stupid and they're in the ivory tower and they don't know what they're talking about. They do, but it's a very different situation in which they are, and the way in which the message is and the content, it's actually still content, is conveyed has to be different. So we should really stick to the content, but make it brief. We should explain briefly or mention what the underlying facts are, because there are facts and findings. And we should say what could be done, or should be done, or at least could be done. So we should explore options. And there has been a lot of talk about what's called now solution-oriented assessments, also within the IPCC. I think that is an important and interesting concept, that scientists would explore options of what if we did this, or what if we did that in response to the problem at hand. Thanks.
So thanks a lot for these critical delivery gaps. And now let me go back to UK and also to have your perspectives, that you have these both views, and how do you envision these institutional dynamics between the global framework and this emerging science policy panel on chemicals, and also according to your institutional vision, what are the gap remainings in this evolving architecture? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, the negotiations to strengthen the science policy panel, in fact, began within SciCam, and the conclusion was made that, in fact, rather than create a scientific body, a subsidiary body, as it's called, within the framework, it should go intergovernmental to have more authority, if you like, in terms of the science around chemicals and waste. And so I think that was a very wise decision to have gone forward, and I do hope that, in fact, it does sort out its issues to become a fully functioning panel. But that does mean that the current framework does not have any scientific body to support it. So it is hugely dependent on the science from elsewhere to be able to input into the conversations and the negotiations. So unlike the Stockholm Convention, it doesn't have this POP review committee or as the Chemical Review Committee in the Rotterdam. So I understand that one of the operating principles that was agreed was that there should be to avoid overlap and duplication. So we must be very mindful of that. And we do know that the global framework on chemicals, we may participate in the plenary of the panel as an observer, and that it's really foreseen that there will be communication amongst all the scientific bodies and international instruments so that we can obtain the best available and relevant information on chemical issues. So I think moving forward in terms of the gap, where we see if we could develop a very close partnership with the intergovernmental panel, that would be ideal, so that whilst it does retain its independence, I think as part of a partnership, we can secure the best possible science and then provide the platforms to be able to use that science and get it out through our channels to the national level. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks both of you for mapping these institutional architectures. So now, despite that, we saw this multidisciplinary institutional framework, we still encounter significant limits when addressing the health dimension particularly. So maybe let me turn to you, Leonardo Trascende. So you're a professor of pediatrics and director of environmental pediatrics division at New York University. You are internationally known for economic studies and documenting the cost from EDC exposure. And you are also a Harvard-trained physician, and you represent the Endocrine Society as observer to the global plastic treaty negotiations. So your research show $340 billion in annual EDC cost in the US alone. So we'd like to hear you about this global scale of this burden. And do we know, especially the additional cost of failing to specifically protect critical developmental windows like the fetal development and the early childhood in terms of cost versus a more general population controls? Thanks.
Thank you, Mikhail. First of all, you don't have costs without disease, and you don't have disease without exposure data. So the reason why we only had, until very recently, US, European, and then later Canadian data on disease burden and cost due to these exposures was explained beautifully by Ms. Aliaga in the previous panel, that we do not have as readily available biomonitoring survey data from other parts of the world, where exposures are actually likely to be greater because of the greater use of pesticides and plastics, which are the chief drivers, let's face it, of endocrine disrupting chemicals as they affect all of us. So very recently, we've begun to develop exposure maps globally, taking the available epidemiologic literature to date, first for bisphenols and then for phthalates. And we're working on PFAS as we speak. And we were able to take the phthalate data and then map out global first mortality due to cardiovascular disease. And what we found was, I'd say, profoundly horrifying, even though I'm just a pediatrician, I'm not an internist, but we're talking about 350,000 deaths globally among 55 to 64-year-olds. And 70% is concentrated in Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation region, which speaks to the urgency in some cases in countries of action where there is large-scale petrochemical production and consumption that is likely driving, unfortunately, disease and disability. And so we're in the process of taking the data about exposure that I alluded to at the top and mapping not just adult disease and disability, but disease across the entire lifespan. Mind you, the economic costs of that mortality are more than the revenue of the plastics industry, 510 billion to 3.74 trillion in social costs associated with the years life lost or years lost of the deaths, frankly, the willingness for society to pay to prevent death. Mind you, the plastics industry revenue is in the range of $500 billion a year. So already, just based on one endpoint, we're talking about disease burden greater than the revenue of the industry. That's, I'd say, profoundly disquieting. So if you were to take the 15 conditions that we had mapped, $340 billion in cost in the US and 163 billion euro. Mind you, those didn't include the mortality that I alluded to due to phthalate exposure. We could be talking about tens of trillions of dollars in lost economic productivity due to pesticides and disease costs due to pesticides and phthalates. And that really speaks to the point you're alluding to, that kids are uniquely susceptible to these exposures. Pound for pound, they breathe in more air, they eat more food, they have developing organ systems that are uniquely susceptible. It's not as though adults are invulnerable. In fact, the stage of life probably speaks to what systems are getting turned the wrong way and what disease outcomes are coming from there. I'll pause there, but I just want to leave you with that reality that we're barely scratching the tip of the iceberg as we get the exposure data in globally. So as these science policy and other frameworks are developed, as we hopefully finalize an ambitious plastic treaty, we need to put in place the frameworks so that in low and middle income countries where biomonitoring infrastructure is not that readily in place, we can do two things. One is to quantify the disease burden, but also measure the chemical exposures that are not, we're barely figuring out in the developed countries in the first place. Because we know, as Dr. Vandenberg alluded to, that we have a chemical whack-a-mole problem. We seem to replace old chemicals with new chemicals. And if we don't measure the new chemicals as they come onto the scene, we may never find a problem that is literally underneath our noses. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, that's the cost and the social cost are huge. So given that EDCs are a global health issue affecting billions of people, we see that the frameworks like the global frameworks on chemicals theoretically include health dimension, but often remain environment-led in practice. So how can we, according to you, strengthen the connections between these frameworks and the global health systems? And what's your perspective on positioning EDCs a bit more prominently within a health-led governance?
Thank you for the opportunity. So I want to reinforce something Dr. Zeller said, and others have reinforced. There's enough information to act. I want to go back to Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who coined this notion of causality. That notion, since his landmark lecture during the tobacco wars of the 1960s, has been mangled and abused. The point is not about causation. The point is about information and the case for action. We acted on Zika virus with very limited causal inference to prevent kids from being born with birth defects. We have the same I'd argue similar urgency of action when it comes to pesticides, plastics, and chemicals used in those materials. So we need solutions, and solutions go to sources. So again, we go back to plastics and pesticides. I would argue that in the framing, in the broader public, when we focused on endocrine-disrupting chemicals, we kind of hid the problem indirectly. Hormones are terribly important to all sorts of biological functions, temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. But we didn't point to sources, and sources bring you to solutions. And solutions require multi-sectoral engagement. We need companies that are doing the right thing. We're hosting a symposium around UNGA, which we hope is still in New York as planned, around solutions in the context of a global plastics treaty. But we believe that companies are acting now, showing true leadership, getting customer revenue, getting market share as a result of those steps. And insofar as we hold them accountable for doing the right thing, they should be rewarded, and they should change market share and consumer action towards where we need to go. So we also need the finance sector to get heavily involved. We know that there are countries where it's going to be harder to get over the activation energy to doing the right thing. We also need to support greater green and sustainable chemistry. And we do need regulatory and legal infrastructure. We know in the United States, for example, that many actions did not occur without legal pressure in the form, I dare say, lawsuits is one of the instruments that need to be at play. I'm not suggesting or minimizing that has to be the end game. In fact, that's often too late. But we need to be the catalyst for change. We need to support education on a broad scale. And that includes healthcare providers that are part of the discussion. Healthcare is a driver of many of these exposures, unfortunately. Some of it is essential. I'm not trying to minimize the essentiality principle. If there are materials that require, for example, plastic, they need to stay if they're essential. Does that mean that there's an exclusion for the healthcare sector? Please, no, thank you. And that's been reinforced by Healthcare Without Harm, by leaders in the healthcare space. So we need to align the solutions with values. It is not as though science is value free. Science is inherently value laden. Healthcare is value laden, like so many aspects of life. But we clearly have a situation in which the science is aligned with the values of preventing disease and disability that affects us all, from cradle to grave and womb to tomb. And the economic data simply adds support that we have misbalanced our trade-offs. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your very interesting insights. So now that we went through these institutional and international developments, we should maybe hear more about what's going on at the local level. So now I'm turning to you, Valentine. So Valentine, you are a former Swiss national councillor, and you have this practical legislative experience in environmental policy, and you were one of those who brought the issue of EDC at the federal level in Switzerland. And you have this specific expertise in translating scientific evidence into more democratic political processes. So how can Switzerland overcome implementation delays? Here, I'm talking about the EU advance on the substance by substance reevaluation on EDCs. And it seems that Switzerland follows it, but very slowly. Could you explain us these institutional constraint and local constraint, and how this global governance should maybe help these national difficulties? Thanks. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Yes, in fact, national regulation are still based on a substance by substance approach, based on the principle of the acceptable daily intake, IDI, according to which everybody could be exposed to a maximum dose of pollutant without effect on his health. This is the application of the old idea that it's the dose that makes the poison, which dates back to the 16th century with Paracelsus. It's not very modern. And IDI is measured for each pollutant using a method that is not scientifically based, invented in the 1930s. And the same method was revised in the 1960s to set ADIs for each synthetic pesticide and food additive. Government authorities then adopted the IDI, which has been applied since. Admittedly, the adoption in 2018 of a definition of endocrine disruptors at European level, and the obligation since 2023 to re-evaluate synthetic pesticide according to this definition is a step forward. But it's not enough, because we are still stuck in the logic of substance by substance evaluation. In Switzerland, it will take until 2080 to re-evaluate the 300 or so synthetic pesticides on the market according to these new standards. It has been nearly 4 decades since the concept of endocrine disruptors first appeared. As you have heard, specialists such as endocrinologists, toxicologists, epidemiologists are familiar with the mode of action of EDCs on the human body. The main point to remember is that it's not the amount of pollutant present that is decisive with these pollutants, but the timing of exposure. Its recurrence and the interaction between several ideas simultaneously. Sorry for the accent. Furthermore, not everyone is equally affected by this exposure. Pregnant women, young children, and adolescents are particularly vulnerable. National regulation, which continue to be based on the idea which presuppose standard renewability and on a substance-by-substance approach, as in Switzerland, are unable to take into account the effect of chronic and multiple exposure to substance that act on a minute scale. There is no national prevention policy on this subject in Switzerland. Endocrine-disrupting chemical pollutants are not even mentioned in the federal strategy for the prevention of chronic diseases. And vulnerable individuals are not given any special attention. This must change. Internal governance based on independent science would enable progress to be made in this area too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Valentine, for these insights. And maybe my follow-up last question for you is how you think should Switzerland ensure these independent scientific assessments while we are sometimes addressing industrial disinformation? And feel free to answer in French, as we discussed previously. Thanks.
Thank you, but I prepare all in English. If you support still my French accent, I can cool the... So, yes, the failure to take independent studies into account in re-evaluation process is a major problem in Switzerland as well. Stemming from neoliberal regulation introduced in the 1980s that have still not been corrected. These regulations shift the task of assessing the toxicity of chemical pollutants to their manufacturers, even though the studies are not even made public. Government public health protection agencies, such as the FSFO in Switzerland, are then responsible for verifying, above all, the proper administrative conduct of the marketing authorization process. The reliability of these private studies is rarely tested on this stage, but only 10, 20, or 30 years later, when problems arise, revealed by courageous independent scientists. There are countless examples. Sometimes this leads to a ban, as in the case of atrazine or chlorothalonil, but more often than not, it is a private industry version that prevails. Glyphosate, or the glyphosate, is a prime example. Classified as a probable carcinogen in 2015 by the EARC, it's a proven endocrine disruptor according to independent scientific criteria. Hundreds of scientific publications have contributed to this. In 2021, the study by Munoz et al. Demonstrates that glyphosate exhibits 8 of the 10 characteristics of an EDA. The three will be announced to determine its belonging to this category. However, following pressure from industrial lobbies, it was reauthorized for the second time in 2023 by the European authorities for a period of 10 years. This is a real scandal. And don't think this is an isolated example. Consider aspartame. The antioxidant 321 derived from toluene consider the entire PFAS family, etc. The list of chemical pollutants with PE properties proven by independent science but ignored by public authorities is endless. This is a capitulation to polluters and an ongoing disaster for both human health and biodiversity, because let's not forget that the EPs affect all living beings. Let's summarize the situation. Chronic hormone-dependent diseases such as cancer, diabetes, obesity, developmental disorders, and infertility are exploding worldwide, affecting increasingly younger people. Chemicals with endocrine-disrupting effects, such as synthetic pesticides, petrochemical-based plastics, PFAS, etc., have contaminated the environment, fresh water, and living organisms. They are the main cause of the collapse of biodiversity in Europe and constitute the most seriously exceeded planetary boundary. These substances are persistent and accumulate in animal organisms, particularly on the top of the food chain. And which animal dominates all food chain? Independent science has long established the causal links between these two phenomena, but national policies continue to refer to data from the chemical industry, even when malpractices and conflicts of interest have been proven. Everyone remembers the Monsanto paper affair, which once again concerned glyphosate. Synthetic PE pollutants all originate from the chemical industry, which has enormous financial resources and exerts direct influence on decision-making. As does in the science industry conglomerate in Switzerland. One of WAR's board members is also a member of the Swiss parliament and related to the multi-billionaire and former federal councillor Christoph Blöcher. This actor disseminates and finances the spread of misinformation about these pollutants. For example, they seek to place highly toxic food additives such as hydrocarbon derivatives, antioxidants, and certain plants such as sage, on the same level of danger in order to dilute their responsibilities. Another phrase often used and repeated by politicians who defend this private interest in debate is, the doses as used are equivalent to a sugar cube dilute in a swimming pool, or the level of danger is equivalent to that of pickled gherkins. Sorry for maybe you heard the same phrases in your own country. It's not a case. The aim of this misinformation is to sow doubt, to make people believe that the current regulatory system is capable of protecting our health and that of our children. This is a lie. It is designed to protect these private interests. And the scientists who produce evidence of this tragedy are victims of financial pressure, discrediting and denigration via social media, as are all those who denounce these facts, including doctors, environmentalists, and journalists. Threats of physical reprisals and even deaths are commonplace. As a climatologist. So I just finished this, the last, is it therefore time to stop denying the facts and to determine who is responsible, and finally to enforce the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle, because the victims of this organized pollution faced with their illness need financial support, but we also already speak about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentine, for this insight. So I give the floor to Jane, maybe for first set of conclusion.
Thank you, Michael. And Congratulations to all the panelists. Thank you so much for being here for both panels. I found it extremely interesting. I think we could have gone on for much longer, but as always, time is of the essence. So maybe just to share a few concluding comments very briefly from our panel. And I will be inspired by what Martin said, as I'm a scientist, say the most important point and then shut up. The science is undeniable. I think that is absolutely the most important point. I also think that regulations need a 21st century overhaul. We heard that very clearly, especially for EDCs, but also for other chemicals in plastics. 16,325 plastic chemicals have been identified. How will we get hazard data for all of those if we go chemical by chemical? So we need to be creative to be impactful. And then last but not least, capacity building is essential. It's essential for regulators. It's essential for politicians to understand what actually is at stake with chemicals. It's essential for citizens. I think we need to do much more to communicate how fascinating chemicals are. Maybe a goal could be, Kay, that everyone can say the scientific name of PFOA in the way that you can say it. But also in the finance sector, importantly, because as we know, money makes the world go round, as you have alluded to so clearly, Valentin. And if the people that are investing long-term understand that they are creating problems with their long-term investments, then hopefully we can sway the way things are going. So with that, I hand back over to Michael. And I want to thank everyone for sticking with us, and especially thank you to the panelists.
Thanks, Jens, and thanks everyone for their valuable contribution and also basis for, of course, further reflection. So on the policy side, what we could say that we have an unprecedented new institutional framework with this GFC and new science policy panel on chemical. And we saw that we have opportunity to ties and to draw strong lines between links between these two institutions. But we have still room of improvement and still a lot to do. But anyway, at any points we need, there is a need for a stronger governance. And as it was highlighted, the cost of EDC exposure for health are huge, and it's greater than the plastic revenue industries, that it was well explained. And at the national level, we need this international governance to accelerate EDC's policies at these national levels. And for this, we need to have clear information to trigger action from the policymakers. So that's in a nutshell what popped out from this reflection on policy. Thanks to all, and I give you the floor, Diana, for closing remarks, maybe. Thanks.
Not closing remarks, but just a big thank you to all. We were so excited to have so many of the experts that we have had online in the past years, all here in Geneva, in the same building. So we are really delighted to have you here around the table. And for those who are here in person, actually, we will continue through bilaterals because there's a reception offered by the Food Packaging Forum. So thank you very much for that, Jane and colleagues. Just to remember everybody that, yeah, this is just the beginning of something, or the continuation of something that should have been, for which we should have been, we should have had more action from what we all clearly know. So we look forward to continue the discussions with you and to have and to boosting action in the various levels where we are all active here. Just also a note for all the speakers, we would like to take a photo all together here. So please, and with that, I think we can close the meeting and thank the over 140 people who joined us also online today. So thank you all, and I think we can applaud.